A 16-year-old girl left her house one morning to catch the bus to school. She never made it, and from the very first day, police had almost nothing to go on. No witness, no suspect, no real trail to follow. For over a year, they threw everything they had at it. Then, it went cold. It stayed that way for decades, passed down from one detective to the next, until a group of college students were handed a stack of dusty files and asked to do one simple thing: organize them. What they found buried inside would finally answer a question this girl's family had been asking for more than 40 years. Sheri Jo Elliott was born in Michigan in the late 1960s. For part of her childhood, she lived with her father near Battle Creek, a smaller town a couple hours from Flint. People who knew her back then describe her the same way, over and over: sweet, friendly, easy to get along with.
Sheri Jo, she was a sweetheart. We're not supposed to have a favorite niece or nephew. She's basically the favorite of most people in the family. But she was a loving child, very respectful.
She was the kind of daughter who called her mother constantly, not because she had to, just to check in, just to say where she was, or what she was doing, or when she'd be home. That habit mattered a lot to her family. And later, it would matter to police, too. In the summer of 1983, when Sheri Jo was 16, she moved to Flint to live with her mother, Joyce, and her stepfather. Changing schools as a teenager is hard for almost anyone. New hallways, new faces. A whole social world you're stepping into from the outside. But by all accounts, Sheri Jo handled it well. She enrolled as a sophomore at Carmen High School that fall, made friends fairly quickly, and settled into her new life without much trouble. She stayed just as close to her mother as she always had. If anything, in a new town, that closeness only grew. On the morning of November 16, 1983, Sheri Jo woke up early, like she did every school day. She got dressed in a maroon jacket and blue jeans, grabbed her school books, and left the house on Seneca Street at around 6 a.m. Her bus stop was a short walk away, at the corner of Dartmouth and Lavelle. She'd made that exact walk dozens of times that semester alone. That morning, she never got there. When Sheri Jo didn't come home from school that afternoon, her mother wasn't panicked right away. Teenagers are teenagers. Maybe she'd gone to a friend's house. Maybe she'd lost track of time. But as the hours passed, and there was still no call, no knock at the door, nothing, that feeling started to shift into something heavier. Joyce began calling around to Sheri Jo's friends. One by one, nobody had seen her. Not at school, not at the bus stop, not anywhere. She hadn't shown up to a single class that day. And for a girl who called home constantly, who never went anywhere without telling somebody where she was, that silence didn't feel like a teenager pushing curfew. It felt like something was wrong. By that evening, the family called the police. Officers began canvassing the neighborhood almost immediately. They walked the exact route Sheri Jo would have taken that morning, from her front door to the bus stop, going house to house, asking if anyone had seen anything out of the ordinary. Nobody had. No one saw a struggle. No one saw a car. No one saw Sheri Jo at all after she stepped out her front door. Word spread through the community fast, and people didn't just sit back and wait for police to work. Family, neighbors, total strangers. They all pitched in. Flyers with Sheri Jo's photo went up in gas station windows, on grocery store bulletin boards, taped to telephone poles all over Flint.
It was terrible. But we went and passed missing signs to everybody, in the neighborhood and in town, and stores would put the missing in the windows.
For days, the entire town was looking for her. Then, 4 days later, the search ended. Just not the way anyone had prayed it would. A man who trapped muskrats for a living was out checking his lines in Saginaw County, a rural stretch of land roughly 35 miles north of Flint. It was routine work, the kind he'd done 100 times before. But that day, along a ditch beside a quiet road, he came across something that stopped him cold. It was Sheri Jo. The trapper didn't touch anything. He drove straight to the nearest phone and called it in. And within the hour, that quiet stretch of road was lined with police cars, their lights cutting through the November gray. Officers taped off the ditch and began working the scene the way they would any other, slowly, carefully, photographing every inch before anyone moved anything. What investigators found at that scene was devastating. Sheri Jo had been shot multiple times. She had also been sexually assaulted. But there was one detail from the autopsy that landed harder than almost anything else. One piece of information her family would carry with them for the rest of their lives.
Detective come knocking on our door early Sunday morning, and she wore one of my necklaces to school, and he had the necklace in his hand. And he said, "Well, is that Sheri's?" I said, "Yeah, this is Sheri's." And she said, "Well, she's dead. And she'd been shot 4 times and raped." And there's no easy way to say that. She was my only daughter.
Based on the condition of her body, medical examiners believed Sheri Jo had still been alive as recently as the day before she was found, which meant that whoever took her off that street corner hadn't killed her right away. He had kept her somewhere, for the better part of 3 days. For investigators, that timeline changed everything about how they looked at the case. A 16-year-old girl doesn't just vanish off a residential street at 6 in the morning without a trace. And she doesn't stay hidden away, alive, for 3 days, without someone, somewhere, noticing something. Sheri Jo's mother said almost exactly that to a local reporter, not long after her daughter's body was found. Somebody had to have seen her being taken, or seen her during those 3 days. Somebody out there knew something. But if anyone did, they never came forward. Not then. Not for a very long time. Detectives started where investigators almost always start, in cases involving a young girl, close to home. Sheri Jo's stepfather, Robert, came under early suspicion, simply because he was the man in the house, and because statistically, family members are the first people police have to rule out. He was brought in, questioned at length about his whereabouts that morning, and about his relationship with his stepdaughter. But detectives couldn't find a single thread connecting him to what happened. No inconsistency in his story, no physical evidence, no motive that held up under scrutiny. That line of investigation went nowhere, and it went nowhere fast. From there, police widened the net. They looked at boyfriends. They looked at classmates. They looked at grown men in the neighborhood with any kind of record at all. Tips came in from the public. Dozens of them in those first few weeks. People calling in to report a strange car they remembered seeing, a man they thought looked suspicious near the bus stop, a rumor a friend of a friend had heard. Detectives ran every single one down, and one by one, every single one of them led nowhere. At the same time, forensic examiners had recovered biological material from Sheri Jo's body during the autopsy. In today's world, that evidence alone would likely crack a case like this wide open, within days. But this was 1983. DNA testing didn't exist yet. Not in any police department, not in any lab, not anywhere in the world. It would be another 3 years before England became the first country to ever use DNA to solve a crime, and even longer before American law enforcement adopted it as a standard tool. So the evidence detectives had in their hands, evidence that would one day hold the entire answer to this case, was essentially useless to them at the time. It was logged, sealed, and placed into storage. And in cases from that era, storage sometimes meant nothing more than an envelope, tucked inside a filing cabinet, sitting quietly alongside thousands of other unsolved files. Weeks passed. Then months, with no forensic tools to lean on, and no witness ever stepping forward, the investigation lost momentum. And within about a year of Sheri Jo's murder, the case had officially gone cold. That didn't mean it was forgotten. Over the following decades, different detectives with the Michigan State Police periodically reopened the file. They'd pull it out of storage, read through it fresh, Maybe follow up on an old lead one more time, hoping some new angle might finally reveal itself. But every single time, they hit the exact same wall they'd hit before. No new witnesses, no new evidence, no way forward. Each time, the file went back into the archive, a little thicker, a little older, and still unsolved. For Sheri Jo's mother, that meant living with an open wound for year after year after year. She raised the rest of her family. She went on with her life, the best way she could. But the not knowing never left her. Every November 16th, the anniversary would come back around, and every single year, Joyce would call the department again, just to ask if anything had changed. Most years the answer was the same: nothing new, no leads, nothing to report. She had spent decades believing that somebody, somewhere, knew exactly what happened to her daughter. She just never got the chance to find out who. In the late 1990s, there was a brief flicker of hope. A new detective, going through old files, sent a portion of the physical evidence out for a fresh look, curious whether the DNA testing that had become standard by then might finally pull something usable. But the sample that came back was too degraded, too limited, to build a full profile from. It was enough to confirm a male suspect existed. It wasn't enough to identify him. Once again, the case slid back into the archive. Then, in 2023, that finally started to change, though not in the way anyone expected. That year, Michigan State Police made the decision to give Sheri Jo's case one more look. But this time, instead of handing it to another individual detective and hoping fresh eyes might catch something everyone else had missed, they reached out to a program at Western Michigan University called the Cold Case Program. The idea behind it was simple: pair unsolved cases with trained college students. Students who carried none of the assumptions or the dead-end theories that decades of prior investigators had already accumulated, and let them go through the files from the very beginning. A team of students was assigned Sheri Jo Elliott's case. They weren't told who the past suspects were. They weren't told which leads had already been chased and ruled out. Their job was simple, on paper, painstaking in reality. Go through every single page, every report, every witness statement, every piece of physical evidence that had ever been logged. Organize it, digitize it, and flag anything at all, that looked like it might have been overlooked. It was slow, tedious work, the kind that doesn't make for exciting television. But as the students worked their way through box after box of 40-year-old paperwork, something caught their attention. Buried among the decades of documents was a piece of biological evidence that, as far as anyone could tell, had never actually been sent out for DNA testing. It had been collected all the way back in 1983, at a time when testing it wouldn't have done anyone any good. And somewhere across the following 40 years, as the case moved from desk to desk, detective to detective, that specific piece of evidence had simply never made the leap into the modern era of forensic science. It had just been sitting there, this entire time, waiting. When detectives learned what the students had found, they moved fast. The evidence was pulled from storage and sent for full forensic-grade DNA sequencing, the same advanced technique used in some of the biggest cold case breakthroughs in the country. And to everyone's relief, 4 decades in a filing cabinet hadn't destroyed it. The sample held up well enough to produce a usable genetic profile of an unidentified male suspect. For the first time in the case's entire 40-year history, investigators had something concrete: a genetic fingerprint belonging to Sheri Jo's killer. The only problem left was attaching a name to it. So detectives turned to genetic genealogy, the same technique that had famously helped identify the Golden State Killer years earlier. It works by comparing crime scene DNA against public genealogy databases, then slowly building out a family tree, until the profile points toward one specific living person. It's not fast, and it's not simple, but it works. At first, the family tree the genealogists built pointed investigators toward a completely different branch. For a few tense weeks, detectives believed they were closing in on a man who had passed away years earlier in a neighboring county. Someone whose background lined up eerily well with the kind of person they were looking for. They started pulling his old medical records, trying to track down any surviving relatives who might be willing to give a comparison sample. But the closer they looked, the more the timeline stopped adding up. He'd been out of state for almost all of 1983. That branch of the tree was a dead end, and investigators had to go back and start narrowing the search all over again. That second pass through the family tree is what eventually led them to a small city just outside Flint, called Grand Blanc, and to a 75-year-old man named Roni Collins. On paper, and in the memory of pretty much everyone who'd ever known him, Collins didn't look anything like the man behind a crime like this. He was a musician. Back in the 1980s, he performed under the stage name Hendrix and played bass in a local band that worked the Michigan circuit for years, mostly booking gigs that catered specifically to teenagers, school dances, house parties, that kind of thing. He was a regular fixture at a bar and grill in Flint, where the owner would later tell a local news station he was one of the nicest guys she had ever met. But as investigators dug deeper into Collins's past, they found something that stopped the whole team cold. This was not the first time his name had come up, in connection with a missing teenage girl. Back in 1969, more than a decade before Sheri Jo disappeared, two teenagers named Pamela Hobley and Patricia Spencer vanished on Halloween night from a small town called Oscoda, Michigan. The last confirmed sighting of either girl was the two of them talking to a man behind the wheel of a van. At the time, investigators learned that Collins had been a familiar face around Oscoda that very year, and that he was known to drive a van of his own. He was brought in and questioned as a person of interest in the girl's disappearance. He denied any involvement whatsoever, and with nothing solid enough to hold him on, police had to let the matter drop. That case, just like Sheri Jo's would be years later, went cold, and stayed that way. Now, more than 50 years after that first questioning, and more than 40 years after Sheri Jo was taken, detectives finally had the scientific tool that could connect Collins directly to her murder. All they needed was a sample of his DNA to compare against the profile the students had helped uncover. But before investigators could ever get that sample, everything changed again. In January of 2026, before police had the chance to approach Collins for a voluntary DNA test or bring him in for questioning, he died by suicide. For a case that had waited more than 40 years for any kind of answer, that news felt, for a moment, like the truth might slip away one final time and take Collins's secrets down with him. But investigators weren't ready to let it go that easily. When Collins died, an autopsy was performed as a matter of standard procedure, and as part of that autopsy, his DNA was collected. That sample was sent straight to the lab and compared against the profile pulled from Sheri Jo's case more than 4 decades earlier. It was a match. More than 40 years after a 16-year-old girl left her house to catch the bus and never came home, Michigan State Police finally had a name for the man responsible. On April 13, 2026, they made it official. Sheri Jo Elliott's murder had been solved. But because Collins died before he was ever arrested or formally charged, there would be no trial, no courtroom, no moment where he was forced, in front of a judge and jury, to answer for what he did. Sheri Jo's family would never get to watch him convicted. They would never get to hear a sentence read aloud. Her mother, Joyce, spoke to a local news station after the announcement, and she didn't hide how she felt about the way Collins's story came to an end. She said simply that she was glad he was dead. She also said that even now, more than 4 decades later, she still thinks about her daughter every single day, and she always will.
Detective Art called me. He said, it's confirmed he did do it. He says, knowing this, how is that going to affect you? I said, nothing's changed. I still can't hug her. I still can't tell her I love her. I said, so nothing's changed. It's good. It's still the same.
For investigators, the case didn't fully close with that DNA match. In some ways, it reopened others. With Collins now positively identified as a predator who had been active in the area since at least the late 1960s, detectives immediately turned their attention back to Pamela Hobley and Patricia Spencer, the two teenagers who vanished in Oscoda back in 1969. He'd been questioned in that case once already, and released for lack of evidence. Now, with his DNA finally on record, police departments across the Midwest began quietly reviewing their own unsolved files, checking whether Collins's profile might connect him to other crimes nobody had ever managed to pin on him while he was alive. As for the students who cracked the case, they never set out to solve a murder. They were simply asked to organize a stack of old files and flag anything that looked out of place. But by doing exactly that, patiently, methodically, without any of the assumptions that decades of detectives before them had carried into that file, they found the one piece of evidence that had been sitting there the entire time, waiting for someone to finally notice it. When the program's director later read the Elliot family's thank you letter out loud to the students at an end-of-semester gathering, she said there wasn't a dry eye in the room. There's one more thing worth sitting with. For 40 years, Roni Collins lived his life completely out in the open. He wasn't hiding in some remote cabin or living under a fake name in another state. He was playing gigs a few miles from where Sheri Jo grew up. He was walking into the same bar and grill, week after week, being told by the people there how kind he was. He had a wife, a community, a reputation as one of the good ones. The entire time he was carrying a secret that only came apart because a handful of college students, most of them younger than Sheri Jo would have been if she'd lived, refused to let an old file stay forgotten. Sheri Jo's family never got the trial they spent 40 years hoping for. But for the first time since 1983, they finally know exactly who took her. And they know, without question, that he will never be able to hurt anyone else again. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.